Hello, my name is Nash Turley with Lawn to Wildflowers. We are a public science project focused on helping people around North America convert their turfgrass lawn into native wildflowers. Before I go on, if you want to learn more about what we're doing, check out our website, lawntowildflowers.org. And we're on all the social media platforms at Lawn Wildflowers. So the main goal for today is to cover some facts about lawns and wildflowers and pollinators that help motivate what we're doing at Lawn to Wildflowers. And then at the end, I'll talk about the specific things that we're doing, including our mobile app. There is a test for today. So these are a bunch of facts that I'm going to cover. So these include the number of bee species, the amount of crop value in the U.S. from pollinators, the amount of water used on lawns, the percentage of plants that are pollinated by animals, the square miles of turfgrass in the U.S., the number of plant species in North America, and the percentage of bees that are declining in the U.S. So it's a matching game. We'll go over the answers at the end. But look out for those. So first, let's cover some depressing facts about lawns. First, just how much turfgrass is there in the U.S.? Now, it turns out that is about 63,000 square miles. And of course, that's just sort of a huge number that's sort of hard to understand. That ends up being about the size of the state of Georgia. So we have just this massive area of turfgrass that's not doing much of anything for wildlife and in many ways is being harmful to the environment. That we could do something better with. Now, how much water is used on turfgrass in the United States? That is about 20 trillion gallons of water that is used domestically outdoors. Primarily, that's for lawns. Now, again, that's another massive number that's a bit hard to know what that means. So as a point of comparison, all other crops that get irrigated in the U.S. use about 30 trillion gallons of water. So lawns are using almost as much water as all of the irrigated crops in the U.S. And I think we can all agree that the cultural and economic value of all those crops is way higher than just grass that doesn't really do a whole lot. And so this ends up being about, especially in desert places, up to half to 3/4 of the water usage domestically. So we hear a lot about droughts and water shortages and things like that. But it's really outdoor watering that's the biggest use of water, and almost all that water that's being sprayed on lawns has been through water treatment plants and all this treatment to make it drinkable, and instead we're just spraying it on grass. So all that turf and all that watering actually makes turfgrass by far the largest irrigated crop in the U.S., way more than any other irrigated crop, if we want to think of turfgrass as a crop. So the many other negative impacts of lawns, and that includes habitat loss. Of course, if something is a mowed turfgrass lawn, it's not going to be other native plants and other structures and uses of a native habitat that could support, other plants and other wildlife. Water pollution, all those chemical inputs can run off and cause a lot of problems, like algae blooms and red tide and all those types of things. Fossil fuel use. One study estimated that an hour of using a lawnmower results in the amount of particulate pollution as driving 100 miles. And of course, anytime you're running a gas-powered engine, that's just extra gas being burned and contributing to climate change. All the chemical inputs could potentially have a big effect on human health, especially the pesticides. It's just really expensive to keep a lawn up. One study estimated about $40 billion a year are spent on lawn care. It'd be great if that money could be directed towards something that's better for the environment. And then finally, pesticides have potential health effects, as I mentioned, but also, of course, have really big ecological effects. Most pesticides are killing all that they encounter, not just targeted at a specific pest. So the EPA says 60 million pounds a year of pesticides were sold and used, which is a pretty massive amount that's largely unnecessary. So let's move on to some facts about wildflowers. So there is about 20,000 species of plants in just North America. So there's an incredible amount of biodiversity. And many of the areas that support this biodiversity are disappearing. So one example of that is longleaf pine savannas. This is the dominant ecosystem type across the southeastern United States, which spread from eastern Texas all the way up to Virginia. And this is an incredibly diverse region with about 900 endemic plant species. So those are plant species that are found there and nowhere else. And that includes the Venus flytrap, which lives in swampy longleaf pine savannas in the North Carolina coast, which is found there and nowhere else. And across longleaf pine savanna, there's about only 3% of it left, making it one of the most endangered ecosystems in the world. And among that 3% that's left, even less than that is managed in a way that promotes native biodiversity. Primarily, that means burning. And so these ecosystems are fire adapted and need frequent fire to maintain native biodiversity. So it's more like 1.5% that's really remnant longleaf pine that's managed properly. So what is the actual purpose of a flower? We obviously like them because they're beautiful, but that's not why they evolved to please us. They evolved for a very different reason. So you can think of a flower as really a billboard, and that billboard is a sign that attracts in pollinators. And those pollinators are coming because plants are pollinators' dominant food source. They eat pollen and nectar. And so they see this billboard for food, and they fly in and collect that, drink the nectar and collect the pollen. And they collect that pollen and they move to another flower to feed on the next one. And then they then move some of that pollen to the other flower. Pollen is essentially plant sperm. So they fertilize that other flower. And that fertilization allows those flowers to produce new seeds and new offspring, which is, if we want plants in the world, we need pollinators to move that pollen around to allow them to reproduce. So let's talk about pollinators for a bit. So what percentage of plants are pollinated by animals? That is about 88%. So that process I just described of animals helping plants reproduce, the vast majority of plants species on the planet require animals to some extent to reproduce. There are many other, plants that don't require pollinators. Often they're wind pollinated. So there's things like pine trees, oak trees, some of our important crops like corn and rice and things like that. They don't require pollinators. But especially in the wild, the vast majority of wild species use pollinators to some extent. So without pollinators, the foundation to our ecosystems, the plants, the primary producers are going to disappear. So pollinators are critically important to the functioning of our world. But pollinators also have more direct impact on us economically, and that's largely through our food. So this study looked at blueberries, and they require pollination, and there's also a bunch of specialist pollinators that pollinate blueberries. So this study, if you look at this graph, the x-axis is the researchers measured an estimate of the number of bee species on the x-axis, and then the y-axis is a measure of pollination, but also a measure of just how much fruit was produced. So what they found is that if you have more bee species, you get a lot higher fruit set. This is a common trend across lots of crops that are pollinated, that if you have more bee species, you get better pollination services. And I'd like to kind of distinguish that. They also looked at bee abundance, and that shows a similar pattern. But this pattern of richness is independent of that, and it shows that it's not just how many bees you have but it's also the diversity of them. So it's a very clear example of the direct value to us of preserving biodiversity. Now, blueberries also have these specialist pollinators, and one of them is a blueberry bee. And they are really good at, they specialize in those weird lantern-shaped flowers that blueberries have. So this one study estimated that a single female blueberry bee can visit 50,000 blueberry flowers, which resulted in 6,000 ripe blueberries, which would then have a market value of about $20. So that was in 1996. I imagine that value is a lot more now. Another thing about blueberries is that honeybees really suck at pollinating blueberries. That's because they can't do this buzz pollinating that blueberry bees do and other native bees do. So basically the pollen is locked up in the flower and it's hard to get out. And a blueberry bee will come up and grab onto the flower and buzz its wings, and it vibrates and it shakes the pollen out. And honeybees can't do that. So they're really they're extremely inefficient at pollinating blueberries and many other crops for that matter. So our native bees and pollinators are much more efficient and better pollinators than the non-native honeybees. So how many bee species are in North America? So first I want to show you some data from a survey study where they surveyed the general public and asked them this exact question. Just throw out a number. How many bee species do you think are in North America? Now this is their data. On the x-axis you see different categories of bee species. So people could guess either between 0 and 500, 500 and 1,000, 1,000, each of those categories. And then the y-axis is the number of people that guessed each of those. So you can see by far the vast majority of the public thinks there's between 0 and 500 species of bees in the U.S. So the real number now we know is closer to in bee species in North America. So the real number of bee species in North America is 5,600. So you can see that most people are not guessing anywhere close to 5,600. And in this study, they concluded that although most of the respondents thought, like almost all of the respondents thought that bees were critically important, only about 14% of people were able to guess within 1,000 of the actual number of bee species in the U.S. So it shows there's a big gap between understanding like how important we think bees are in general, just basic understanding of their biology. Okay, so this was another part of that study where they asked people to identify if something was a bee or not, and they showed them these individual photos. So there's 10 photos. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through them, and as I go through, just say to yourself, is that a bee or not? Number 1, is that a bee? 2, bee. 3, 4, 5, 6, is that one a bee? This blue one here, is that a bee? Number 7. Number 8, is that a bee? Number 9, is that a bee? And then this green shiny one here, is that a bee? So let's look at the data. So this shows each of those 10 species, and the y-axis is the number of participants that thought it was a bee. So the first 3 really show up as most everyone thought it was a bee. That's a bumblebee, a honeybee, and this sweat bee that kind of looks a lot like a honeybee. Pretty much everyone thought those were bees. But then we go to this next bee, a mining bee, an andrena. Now we're down to about 60%. So most people, a lot of people are not thinking that's not a bee. Then we have a velvet ant, which about 40% of people thought was a bee. Then we have 2 more bees that we're down at about less than 40% of people thinking are bees. It's the green sweat bee and the mason bee, the shiny iridescent. They're actually both quite common. And so we see that most people aren't even recognizing those as bees. Then we have the few other species that don't look anything like bees that really no one thought. So it shows that there's not a great understanding of the diversity of shape and look to bees among the thousands of species that exist out there. Now, you may have heard about bees declining. So this was a survey of the literature that found that about half of the bee species that have been studied are declining. So more specifically, 52% of bee species studied, which is a lot of bee species, over 1,400 bee species that had been studied, found that they were declining quite significantly. So declining by 40% or more. So it's a very striking pattern that half of bee species that have been studied are declining. And many of the species haven't been studied, but still that's a very large number, over 1,400 that have been studied. And we see this very clear and disturbing pattern that our native bees are really struggling. Another study looked at native bee decline by area. So this is a heat map that shows if there's evidence of native bees declining. So the yellow regions in the map are areas where there's a lot of evidence for a decrease in bee abundance. And then the blue areas are, maybe they're doing okay. So really in big agricultural areas like across the Midwest, the Mississippi Valley, the Central Valley of California, these really striking declines in native bees. And then other areas, areas where there's more wild, especially across desert west, they seem to be doing okay. So it's really quite striking patterns. And they estimated that just between 2008 and 2013, the estimated bee abundance was declining across 23% of the U.S. land area. So a quarter of the land area of the U.S. we see estimated striking declines in wild bee abundance. And that's just very recently. That's just between 2008 and 2013. So it's almost disturbing to think of how much bees may have declined if we were to go back further in time. A more recent study of all insects suggests there's about a 9% decline in the abundance of land insects, not aquatic insects, but land insects every decade. So 9% decline every decade, consistently every decade. So sort of aggregate that over time, we're seeing a really long-term striking pattern of the decline of insect species. Now, what's the cause for all these pollinator declines? Of course, there's a lot of them. The main one, perhaps not surprisingly, is habitat loss. Pollinators require flowers for their food, and they also require nesting sites. And a lot of times those are very specific natural habitats, and those are disappearing. Then pesticides, of course, are a really big threat to pollinators and bees. And then there's many other factors that are also important. Climate change and pathogens and invasive species, especially invasive plants, often don't provide the resources that pollinators need. And then all of these interact to sort of have a bigger effect than any one of them would on their own. A lot of research is showing these interactive effects of, say, habitat loss and climate change are having this synergistic effect of reducing pollinator populations. Now, of course, pollinators are not just bees. There are many other types of pollinators, which include wasp, a few different types of birds. In North America, that's hummingbirds, quite a few different beetles, ants, moths and butterflies are super important. And then there's bats are pretty important in some places, even lizards, lizards and primates. When there's primates, some of those can be pollinators as well. Now, I want to talk a little bit about honeybees. So here, when we think about pollinators, mostly we hear about honeybees. And when we think save the bees, often sort of things you'll see are focusing on honeybees. But honeybees are a non-native, semi-domesticated species, and they are from Eurasia. So here in North America, honeybees are not native. So they're not at all in the same category of all the native species of pollinators I was talking about before. They're much more akin to thinking of them as like cattle, like chickens or other domesticated animals. They are, of course, very economically valuable. They are used to pollinate, brought in to pollinate a lot of our food crops. So it's not that they're not important, just in the way that other domesticated species are very important. But they don't have the same conservation value as the native species. And keeping honeybees or having honeybees in agricultural areas does not help native pollinators at all. In fact, it's detrimental to native pollinators. And it doesn't really help the environment in most cases. They often can have negative effects on plant populations as well because they're generalist, non-native pollinators. So hopefully when we're talking about the need for conservation and changing our habits, I really want people to focus their attention on native pollinators and native bees and not honeybees. Now, how much do pollinators contribute to U.S. crop value? So we know that they're important, but what's a dollar value we can actually put on that? So a recent study estimated that is about 11%. So that's about over $14 billion a year of our crops. Of the crop yield we have, and the value of that yield is contributed directly to pollinators. You may have heard other numbers in the past that's more like 1/3. And that was a very sort of crude estimate. More recent studies have gone into really the exact amount that pollinators contribute to each crop and how much each one is grown and things like that. It may seem like it would be higher because a lot of our crops do, a majority of our crop species do require pollinators, but many of our most important crops don't, like corn and wheat and rice don't need or require pollinators at all. And those benefits of the economic benefits of pollinators are spread out sort of unequally around the country. You can see they're generally aligned with big agricultural areas, but especially agricultural areas that grow vegetables and fruit. So if you look at the Central Valley in Florida, that's where many of our vegetables and fruits are from. In Eastern Washington, that's apples and cherries and things like that. And then, Michigan, there's lots of orchards and things that require pollination. Across the Midwest here, apparently that's driven primarily by soybeans, which do have some amount that's helped by pollinators. Then, down in Florida, we have lots of other orchard crops and vegetables that benefit from pollinators. And another one that's interesting is in the Southwest, it's cotton. Cotton is actually a lot of the economic value from pollinators is from cotton, and a lot of that is grown in the Southwest. So there are many, many crops that benefit or actually require pollinators. So I put together this list of crops that over 50% of their yield is dependent on pollinators. And many of them, it's like almost 100. So my interpretation here is if the yield of a crop was to drop by 50% or more, it would probably not be economically viable and probably would not be farmed anymore. So I think it's pretty safe to say if the pollinators disappeared, all of these crops would disappear as well. So let's see if I've practiced naming all of these. Let's go. We got peaches, apples and pears, kiwis, cherries, cantaloupe, blackberries, almonds, blueberries, cashews, squash, cucumber, plum, avocados, chocolate, mangoes, and watermelons. So this is most of the big crops in the world that are highly dependent on pollinators. All of these great foods would very likely not exist without pollinators. All right, we've made it to the end of the quiz. So let's review. So the number of bee species in North America, that is about 5,200 species. The crop value of pollinators, it's about 11% of U.S. crop value. The amount of water used on lawns is 20 trillion gallons a year. Percent of flowering plants pollinated by animals, 88%. Square miles of turfgrass just in the U.S. is 63,000 square miles, about the size of the state of Georgia. Number of plant species, 20,000. And the percent of bees in the U.S. that are estimated to be declining, about 52%. So all of those are really many of the motivating facts that inspired Lawn to Wildflowers and to inspire us to make a change to help address a lot of these problems. So let's talk about our projects. So before I get into some of the specific things we're doing, I want to talk about a survey we did. So we wanted to better understand our audience and specifically to ask them which factors might prevent them from converting a portion of their lawn to native wildflowers. So we really want to know I think we think we know now. A lot of people think this stuff is important, native plants and pollinators, but most people aren't taking action. So why is that? So we did an online survey, and we had over 3,000 people from around the country take the survey, which we were very happy with. We did target some of our marketing towards native plant societies. So this is largely an audience that's pretty interested in this topic. So sort of interpret the results with that in mind. So we asked them a bunch of different reasons that might prevent them from converting a portion of their lawn to wildflowers. So those were in 3 categories. The first one is like personal reasons. So that could be maintenance costs, time, not knowing what to do, space for recreation, and just how it looked. We also asked some things that were more to do with nature factors like undesirable plants, undesirable wildlife, and bee stings. And then things that were sort of factors that involved other people, like opinions of neighbors, homeowners associations, policies, and local government. So we asked everyone that took the survey to select which of these might prevent them. So here's the overall result. So this shows the x-axis, the length of the bars here is the percentage of people that selected each of these factors, and then we have the various different reasons. So a lot of people selected none of them. So, about over a third of people are saying, none of these would prevent me. And actually, a lot of the people that took our survey had already created wildflower plots. But then the next 2 most important factors were maintenance time and not knowing what to do were the biggest factors. Almost over a quarter of people were saying these were the most important factors. Now, I mentioned a lot of people had created plots before. In general, if people had said they'd created a plot or were a member of a native plant society, some other pollinator plant organization, they were much more likely to select none apply or much less likely to select any of the other factors, which makes a lot of sense. If you've already created a plot, you're not going to have these factors that prevent you. But there were some factors that didn't follow that pattern. And those were these external factors based on other people. So infractions from local government, HOA policies, and opinions of neighbors. These were, somewhere around 10% of people selected these factors, but they didn't go down if people had already created a plot. So I see these problems as very persistent. Even if you know what to do, you're already on board, you're super keen to make a plot, you still may be deterred by what your homeowners association policies are, or worried about getting a fine, or what your neighbors might think. So it is a problem that I think somehow we would like to address, although if you have any ideas, get in touch with us if you have ideas of how we could address these issues. Okay, so lawn to wildflowers specifically, let's talk about our goals. So these are to help people throughout the country to convert turfgrass lawns to native wildflowers. We have a mobile app that provides online tools to help people identify pollinators and also to help make it easier to create these wildflower plots. And also that mobile app platform allows people to collect data on the effectiveness of lawn to wildflower plots. So they can go out and collect data on pollinators anywhere, really, so that they can contribute to the science of better understanding patterns of pollinator populations across the country. So our mobile app, I mentioned, this is really kind of the main focus for us to achieve a lot of our goals. It is now out now. It can be downloaded on the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store, and for any mobile device. The main features, it has a pollinator guide, pollinator ID game, a wildflower guide, and methods, among several other things. So I'll go over some of those features. First one is just plot methods. It's pretty simple. It's just step-by-step guidelines. And so we saw in our survey that not knowing what to do was an important factor. So we're hoping that these very simple, easy to follow guidelines will help people decide what methods to use when creating a wildflower plot. So I want to talk about the one method that we have, which is my favorite. Before I get to that, I just want to mention we are sort of encouraging people to start small. Like the default is just let's do a small plot, 6x6 foot plot to get people started. It's very manageable, and it still is big enough to attract pollinators. So my favorite method is the sheet mulching method. So that goes like this. Basically, go get a bunch of cardboard. Maybe you have a bunch, or I just went to a dumpster, just pulled out a bunch of cardboard, put down many layers of it, like 3, 4, 5 layers, so that the grass, any of the plants below can't poke through. And then I often put mulch over that or something to keep it down. And then leave it for at least 2 to 3 months. And then after that, you can go and then plant in your native plants. In this photo is actually a plot where we remove the mulch and cardboard. But in this method, you can leave the mulch and cardboard in place and just dig through it and plant. So I think this is going to be a helpful method to kill the grass and to keep down weeds. And then as you go forward, you can decide if you want to keep mulching it or let it go more wild. And then it's important to try to water them. If you're planting in potted plants, to try to water them for a while. But if you're selecting native plants, hopefully after a month or two, they should be pretty good on their own without needing to be watered or specific maintenance like that. So our tool also our app has a tool to help you select plants that are pollinator friendly and native to your region. So there's 3 main themes. Is of course go native. Many studies now show that native plants support more insects and are better for native pollinators and other native insects like caterpillars, which are really important as food for birds. So there's many, many reasons why selecting native plants is a much better for the ecology of your region and helping nature and wildlife much more. 2 is to maximize diversity. I spelled diversity wrong. At least one spelling error had to exist in here. So we want to maximize diversity. And if we just think about pollinators, then if you have more diversity of plants, they'll tend to flower throughout the year. And a lot of native pollinators are only active during a short time of year. So you want to have some species that flower earlier in the year, some in the middle, some later. And that way you can capture pollinators that are active through different times of year. And also maximizing diversity means you get different types of flower shapes and colors and things, and different pollinators specialize on different types of flowers as well. So it's really as simple as if you have more diversity of plants, it can help support more abundance and diversity of animals. And that's pollinators, but also other types of animals like caterpillars and bugs and birds and everything else as well. So it's always good to maximize diversity. And the last one is right plant, right place. You want to select plants that will do well in the region that you select. So that's in the broad region. So if you're in, Arkansas, you want to pick plants that are native to your region of Arkansas. But it can also be a smaller scale factors as well. So what type of soil do you have? Is it sun or shade? Those are probably the 2 most important, is the soil type and sun or shade. So you want to pick plants that are going to do well in those conditions. And the last part of that is you also just want to pick plants that are good for you too. I mean, it's your yard, it's your garden. So look at, if it's pretty, if you like it, if it's somewhere where you want short plants, don't put something that's going to get really tall. So we have some specific resources on our app to help you find plants. So on the app and on our website, it'll pull up a map and you can select your region in the map. So there's quite a few regions. There's still pretty broad regions, but still it'll help you get things that are at least appropriate for your region. So if you select California here, it'll pull up this list of species that are pollinator-friendly species for California. And most of these lists, we actually got the data and suggestion from the Xerxes Society. So they had put together some of these pollinator-friendly lists already. So we got the permission to add those lists to our app. And if you click on any one plant, it'll pull up some of those details, like when it blooms, what flower color is it, if it needs a lot of water or not, and its height, and then maybe some other facts about it as well. So hopefully this is a tool if you're going to a nursery that has native plants and you want to support pollinators, pull this out and you can look through this list and ask them if they have any of these plants. And this list is also available on our website as well. One other thing I want to mention on the plant guide, we also, for each of those regions, link to a seed source. So it's a company that sells native seeds that are broadly native to those different regions. They're not super location specific, just because there isn't a market for that. But at the broad scale, you can find a seed mix that's appropriate for, the American Southwest or the Northeast, and they're all native species for those regions in those lists. So it'll just link you to that company to buy the seed mix. Now, in our app, we also have a pollinator guide, and this is essentially like a rough field guide to major pollinator groups. So for each pollinator group, there you can click on it, and then there's a series of photos that you can look through that sort of help you recognize that group, and then a bunch of facts about how to identify them, and then sort of some aspects of their natural history and biology. So we broke pollinators down into 8 major groups. If you really start to understand pollinators, you need to know these groups. And the first one is honeybees. So I talked a bit about honeybees before. They're incredibly common in most areas. Unfortunately, they are the most abundant pollinator. And of course, they are non-native species. The next is bumblebees. I think we all normally recognize a bumblebee. They're big and fuzzy. Super cute, and they're great, important pollinators. There's hundreds of species, and most of them are social, like honeybees are. So these groups that we're most familiar with are social bees. But when you get into other bee, all those thousands of other bee species, the vast majority of those, like 90% of them, are solitary. They don't live in big social groups like honeybees and bumblebees. So they're out there on their own doing their thing, and many of them are very specialized. They only feed on certain types of flowers or nest in certain habitat types. Most of them nest in the ground, or in like other plant matter and things like that. So there are lots of things we can do to help support these other bees. The main ones are try to provide natural areas that they can nest in, and then of course provide a diversity of flowers for them. Now, wasps are another category of pollinators or flower visitors. There are many different types of species of wasps that'll sometimes visit flowers. This photo is a cuckoo wasp that tends to visit flowers. There's a whole group of wasps called flower wasps that look a lot like bumblebees and other bees sometimes, and they're furry. They specialize on visiting flowers. Many other wasps sometimes visit flowers, like predatory wasps, yellow jackets, and things like that will sometimes visit flowers. They're not necessarily pollinators exactly, but they do often drink nectar. The next group is flies, and they can be really important pollinators. They're probably the next most important group of pollinators after bees. So there are many, many fly species that visit flowers, especially syrphid flies or bee flies or hoverflies. They have many names. A lot of them mimic bees and can look a lot like bees, and they're by far the most important group of pollinators. And also their larvae are predators and eat aphids and stuff. So they have potential biocontrol in agriculture and pollination services. So they're really great. Next group is beetles. There are a lot of beetles that visit flowers and sometimes contribute to pollination. So especially like longhorn beetles and scarabs, tumbling flower beetles, lots of groups of beetles that'll visit flowers, and they have a huge variety of appearances because beetles are incredibly diverse. It's over 300,000 species of described beetles. But if you sort of get to recognize their hard shell and that line down their back, they tend to be pretty recognizable. But some of them also mimic bees and wasps, so they can be tricky. Next is butterflies and moths. This is all part of one group called the Lepidoptera, an order of insects. Again, incredibly diverse, hundreds of thousands of species. And the vast majority of those are moths. Moths are way more diverse than butterflies. And butterflies visit flowers. They're not particularly good pollinators because they don't gather pollen. Their mouth is just a straw that they suck up nectar with. And more important pollinators are moths. A lot of moths fly at night and can be really important, also rivaling the importance of flies in terms of their pollination value. So moths are really where it's at in terms of important pollinators, but often what you'll see the most just flying around in the day are butterflies. Then there's other, which is just everything else. Often they aren't pollinating exactly, but they are flower visitors or sitting on flowers. In this photo is a ambush bug, and they don't, they're actually predators and they'll catch pollinators, but they're seen on flowers. There's just many other groups of insects that'll sometimes be on flowers. And if you know these 7 other groups well, then you can categorize everything else as an other. And at least that's, it's not those 7 other groups. So to help learn all those pollinator groups, our app has a game. It's an interactive game. So in each level of the game, it'll challenge you to identify a series of photos, and if it's a one pollinator group or another. So in this case, there's a photo of a bee, and it's asking, is it a honeybee or a bumblebee? In this case, it's a bumblebee. So if you click bumblebee, it would come up and say, "Oh, good job." And then for each level, there's information about those different groups, and it'll pull up and it'll tell you, tips on how to distinguish between those two groups. At the end of each level, it'll show you sort of your results screen of, what you got right and what you got wrong. And you can then click and it'll give you more information on how to recognize each of those pollinator groups. So if you get through the whole game, you have to beat each level, get 70% of the questions right on each level. It unlocks a new feature of the app, which is data collection. So really one of the goals of the game is to train people as scientists to get out and collect pollinator data. So once they beat the game, they're sort of like certified pollinator data collectors, and they can go out and collect data on those same pollinator groups. So you can go out anywhere and hit start, and the app will record your location and how much time you spend, and you can click and count whatever pollinators you're seeing, and it'll count them up. And then it also asks questions once you're done about what type of habitat you're in, flowers you're seeing, how far you walk, things like that. Basic, things that pollination biologists would collect. So our goal is really to enlist the public throughout the country to participate in the scientific process of better understanding our pollinators. So that kind of wraps up our main goals and projects at Lawn to Wildflowers. To just summarize, we have a vast area that's this sort of biological desert, which is turfgrass, which are not helping wildlife and in many ways actively hurting wildlife. Instead, we could replace that with something so much better. In this case, we're focusing on native wildflowers. So we could directly convert something that's harmful into something that's beneficial. And then we can use that as a tool to help pollinators and then go out and collect data on those pollinators. So that kind of wraps up what Lawn to Wildflowers is all about. So thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Lawn to Wildflowers, go to our website and you can join our newsletter. You can email us at lawnwildflowers@gmail.com or get in touch with us or follow us on all of the social media platforms. Thanks. Bye.